tonight, huh?
Lionel, is that you?
There, I think I got it.
Two Bruces, no waiting.
Yeah.
Hey,
really.
there you go.
Lionel, you got it in stereo.
Hi, my name is Lionel. This is my brother Bruce. This is my other brother Bruce.
You've been waiting a long time to use that one, haven't
I
you?
have been waiting a long time to use that. That almost sounds as funny as hi. What was his first? What was his name?
Larry and the Darrells.
Yeah. Hi, my name's Larry. That's my brother Daryl. Lionel and the Bruces is almost as funny. It could have worked, I think, if they'd had that choice. But Larry is such a funny name.
Yes.
Larry is a name. I met a dog the other day named Doug.
Doug the dog. That's a great name for a dog.
So today, wherever you are, if you're listening to this on the Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Turnpike, or driving along the Arizona border in Yuma, south of Yuma, Arizona, or you're driving between Anchorage, Alaska, and Fairbanks, Alaska, or you're in the United Kingdom driving to work, or any other many possibilities. You're in Australia working the farm. You're out in the fields, and you're in your 14,000 acre farm there.
I wonder if they listen to us on the International Space Station.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Wherever you are in this great globe or the great universe, tonight we have somebody that I think is going to be really cool to talk to. We have a fella named Blair. I think his last name is Kooistra. I don't even know how to pronounce his last name. But anyways, this is a name that I recognize from railroad photography in Trains magazine and all sorts of places. It's just the kind of name you recognize. So I'm dying to. So I sent out a message to this fella. I said, hey, would you like to be on the podcast? And he was like super enthusiastic, which is another good sign, because you get two kinds. I've only ever had two people refuse to be on the podcast. And then I have people that go, okay. And then some people will say, what's the topic? And I will go, well, like trains and your life. And they'll say, do you have a range of questions? And I'll go, no. But if I ever get a list of questions, you'll be the first one to have them. And so tonight we're gonna talk to Blair. So if somebody could go and get Blair out of the green room, that would be swell.
We'll let the second Bruce do that.
The second Bruce, all right. I'll go down and get him.
All right. That just
Hey, Blair, come on up here now.
Good day.
Just don't watch the spot on the couch there.
Yeah.
Oh.
Bruce, that sounds
exactly.
Bruce, that just sounded like you were slamming your head into the wall. So, Blair.
Yes, sir.
You have to be careful where you sit on the couch. Somebody McGurked on it. And
is that what it's called up there? Okay.
Yeah, or there where we're actually in our offices are in Busted Knuckle, Kentucky. That's where you are now.
It's spacious. It's very spacious.
Yeah, exactly. We painted it just specially for you. So Blair.
Gas station washroom green.
Yeah, gas station washroom green. It's Art Deco. So
That's almost a good era.
So Blair, what's the proper way to pronounce your last name?
Well, it's Kooistra, and there's probably 3% of the population who can get that. But if you drop one of the O's out of the last name, it's a lot easier to pronounce.
Okay.
Kooistra. I wouldn't have got that in a million years.
Oh, so we're not one of the 3%, obviously.
No.
Well, the 3% all live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So
is that where you're from originally?
That's where my dad's from. Yeah.
And where are you from?
I was born near Chicago. So.
Okay, like in
moved in Illinois.
Okay, like near Chicago. Was there a town, or was it out in a field? Was it out in a field, or?
Well, it was. I guess it would be Harvey, Illinois, Cook County. But I was living at the time when I was born in Park Forest, which was at the time a fairly new plan development, big post-war suburbia kind of thing.
And how old of a man are you, if you don't mind me asking?
57.
You're a strikingly handsome man for your age.
Now, those are old photos. So.
So when did you move from Illinois to where did you move to after Illinois? And Blair, something's moving around there, buddy.
There we go.
There you go.
There we go.
All right.
My dad was a pharmaceutical salesman. So for Park Davis, pretty much his whole post-World War II career was working for Park Davis Pharmaceuticals. So I would say 64, he got transferred to Denver. 69 to Salt Lake City. 76, he took a promotion in Seattle. And I was there until I graduated high school, went to college up in Bellingham. There's a Canadian connection here coming up.
Great.
And worked several newspaper jobs post-college, and then ended up in Fort Worth, Texas since 95.
Okay,
so I've been here since 95.
So you know that Texas isn't in Canada, right?
There is a Canadian river, however, in Texas.
Oh, is it? What's the Canadian connection you were referring to?
Well, I went to college at Western Washington University in Bellingham.
Right.
So it's about 20 miles from the Canadian border.
Right.
At the time, the drinking age was 21. See where I'm getting here? And, I'd be sent, I made a side income buying alcohol for my dorm mates who were not yet of legal age, and I would make a run across the border for Kokanee, Okie Dokie.
Yeah.
And Molson and Labatt's, and we really couldn't get the Seattle TV stations, so we watched a lot of CBC and BCTV and a lot of hockey. And
wow.
Actually, my minor in college was Canadian Studies.
Really?
Yeah.
And what about Canada stuck out in your head other than you could buy beer?
Well, great railroads in Canada, of course. I liked the history, that there was a country so close to the U.S. that I, at the time, didn't know very much about. And that was a fascinating history. By the way, happy 150th.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank
Yes,
you.
sir.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, and I had a very good college teacher, and I decided to make that my minor because he was such an engaging professor. So.
Okay. And do you remember his name?
Harley Hiller.
Well, there you go. Harley Hiller.
That's a handle.
Yeah.
Sounds like a guy from the Music Man, doesn't it?
Yeah. You got trouble right here in River City.
We got trouble right here in River City.
So you moved all over the place. Now, okay, I have a Bellingham connection.
Oh, yes?
Yep. In the late 60s, there was a show on ABC called Here Come the Brides.
Okay. The bluest skies you've ever seen here in Seattle.
Exactly.
What a crock that was.
Yeah. And my wife, through a long series of events, became the fan club president of the female lead of that show. And her name was Bridget Hanley. And,
wow.
And that was by the time she was like 17. So she was already, and the male lead was a fella named Bobby Sherman, who became a pop star, a teeny bopper.
Oh, yes.
Pop star. And, so then she got to know the crew, everybody on the cast. And then in the 20th anniversary, which would have been at 1987, we hosted, my wife and I was along for the ride by then. We hosted a party, a 20th anniversary party for the crew and cast at Carol O'Connor's restaurant in Beverly Hills. And at that point, then we got to be friends with the guy that played Captain Clancy. And he was also in my favorite commercial, the Heinz ketchup commercial. And he lived and retired, and eventually his final resting place was none other than Bellingham, Washington. So we have been to Bellingham, Washington on more than one occasion.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. So we have connections. We are like brothers from another mother.
Like brothers. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So when do you remember your first interest in trains?
Well, I have a vivid memory of must have been right before moving out of Chicago. A rainy morning. It's weird how these things just stick in your mind. A rainy morning, Homewood, Illinois Central passenger platform. My father later told me that he had dropped my mom, who was pregnant at the time, off with my sister off at her doctor for a checkup. And it was just blocks away from the IC station, I guess, in Homewood. And my dad took me over there, and we watched an Illinois Central passenger train of some sort, rainy morning, but I remember those orange and brown cars. So I have this affinity with the IC that goes back to 64, I would imagine.
Right. And so at that point then, so how old would you have been, do you figure?
4 years old. That's probably one of the first things I can remember.
Wow. And so go ahead.
Oh, but the railroad thing really didn't kick in until teenage years.
Yeah.
So, discovered a box of, I'll tell this story, a box that it stuck in a basement cubby hole someplace, several boxes of magazines, a few Playboys, a lot of Trains magazines. I spent more time looking at the Trains magazine, so right then you got Train nerd going on.
Right.
But my dad had a lot of Trains magazines he had collected from the 50s. Now, he grew up in Grand Rapids, and that was an era in the 30s, late 30s, when railroading was really on the consciousness of a lot of people. It wasn't like today. So he grew up enamored of the Pere Marquette and the whatever the subsidiary of the New York Central is going into Grand Rapids. Had a high school teacher who would take him on weekends watching trains and such. So he was a bit of a rail fan, although he says that riding around in Europe in troop trains and in the U.S. Before and after World War II cured him of any desire to ride a train again. But he bought Trains magazines. My older sister, who he hoped would be a boy, I would imagine, he bought a lot of Lionel stuff for before the baby was born. Turned out to be a girl.
So have you ever been interested in model railroading as such, or are you primarily interested in photography of trains and the prototype?
Oh no, I modeled. I still model. I dabble in a little bit. I actually had a layout that was in Great Model Railroads, I think in 2003.
Exactly.
Maybe 2004.
Right.
So, So they're still modeling. It vacillates time and interest and money. And, sometimes I go on a bent for several years of modeling and then back off from it and then pick it back up again.
I feel like there's like 1,000 questions to ask you because, like, you were even, recognized in the 50th anniversary issue of Trains magazine. You're a prolific railroad photographer.
More prolific in the past, but it was quite a motivating thing when I was in my teenage years, and it gave me a reason. I developed the interest in the railroading and the modeling, and then the photography came along, and the photography gave me a reason to get out and rail fan, but at the same time, the railroads gave me a reason to develop an interest that led to a career as a photojournalist for a decade.
Okay, so we can't skip over that. It's kind of like I'm stuck as to where. Okay, so let's stick with the teenage years for now. So all of a sudden you wake up, bolt upright one day in bed, and go, "I'm going to go outside. I'm going to go out and photograph trains." Like, you've got your own driver's license, have you? Like, by this time you got your wheels and everything.
Yeah, well, in the 70s, there wasn't a lot of social networking like there is now. So I can look at it the way the young generation, I guess you could call them, are all connected with each other on Facebook, and everybody knows what's going on, and they're seemingly going on trips and meeting up with other people. But of course, that wasn't the case in the 70s when I came up. So it was just a matter then of, there's a guy in high school who likes trains. That's cool. It was a nerdy thing then, so you really didn't let it get out that you were a rail fan, and then you'd end up going to an NRHS meeting, which was mostly a bunch of old guys who wanted to talk about steam engines. So, I kind of dabbled in that, and then you'd meet up with eventually some kind of kindred souls that were interested in contemporary stuff. So, you'd go on afternoon trips, or I knew a fellow, Art Chase. He was, I guess I met him through a model railroad club in Salt Lake City, and today he's one of the guys who's involved in a restoration of a steam engine in Fairbanks, Alaska. But back then, Art and I were, about the same age, 13, 14 years old. I'd ride my bike 7 or 8 miles down to his house, and we'd get on our bikes and go another mile or so over to the UP main line and watch the local switch engine work. So... that's how that developed, initially at least.
All right, we can't pass the Bruces. Feel free to jump in here whenever you want. The Bruces, we can't pass. What was the fellow's name? Art Chase?
Art Chase.
ARTCHASE?
Correct.
Just the way it sounds.
Yep.
Okay. Art, and he's working on the 557 in Anchorage?
That sounds right. Anchorage or Fairbanks, I believe.
It's in Anchorage, I believe. It's
in Anchorage. Okay.
And he is probably an acquaintance of one of our regular listeners, Mr. Stuart Sterling, who, by the way, is a former F1 ace. He won Monaco in '86.
Okay.
And now drives UPS trucks, but they're double trailered.
No left turns.
Yeah. Stuart Sterling, it just sounds like the name of a former F1 ace, so I dubbed him.
It does.
I dubbed him a former F1 ace.
Oh, I'm thinking of Sterling Moss.
Exactly. There you go. Right. Exactly.
All right.
Sterling Moss. For some reason or other, when I was a kid, I always thought Sterling Moss was Canadian. I don't know why.
It sounded too British to me.
Yeah, well, I don't know why, but I was so disappointed sometime in my adulthood when I found out he wasn't Canadian, and I had convinced myself beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was.
But a fellow member of the Confederacy, so.
Yeah, there you go. So anyway, yes, so our friend Stuart Sterling. Stuart, if you know Art Chase, you got to send us a message and tell us all about it. So there's probably a connection there. We're only like 15 minutes in, and we've already made a connection with one of our listeners.
That's a small world.
It is a small world, especially when you're podcasting throughout the universe.
Sure.
So, okay, at what age, like, were you 18 or something when you started photography, or?
No, actually, that was probably, my dad made an ordeal of every family holiday because everything had to be documented on photographs and movies, right? So my greatest memories of Christmases are either myself or one of my sisters at some time having a meltdown because, Dad wanted to choreograph or orchestrate the whole Christmas thing, right? So we were getting all pissed off about that. But so my dad was a photographer, and I picked it up through him. And when I was 13, I got an SLR, a film camera,
right,
for those for Christmas, and I set out from there, making black and whites, and then picked up with shooting Kodachrome slides. So I would guess by the time I was 14, I was getting pretty devoted to being a photographer. Started to do that yearbook work in high school newspaper work, and but I didn't do my own darkroom work. That was a little bit later.
Okay.
So
were you 15, 16 when you started photographing trains?
Actually, probably about 14.
All right.
So 14, and then we moved to Seattle in 1976.
Huh.
So And that's kind of where the journalism angle kicks in, because I was already working like school newspapers and school yearbooks and stuff. And I had, after school jobs, but they were all like, washing dishes or working as a fry cook or working as an ice cream place. But when we moved to Seattle, I decided, I don't want to do any of this food service stuff. I want to work at a newspaper. So there was a local newspaper that had just started up. This is pretty rare in the 70s for a daily newspaper to start up, and it started up in my new hometown in Bellevue, Washington, suburban town near Seattle. It was a weekly newspaper, and they decided that they would compete with the Seattle dailies, and they started up a daily newspaper. And it just so happened that I moved to town and went down there and said, is there any job I could do? I applied for whatever job they had. And about a week or two later, they called me up and they said, hey, we need a copy clerk, which at the time, you've seen old newspaper movies. So the guys who work on the copy desks are always sticking their arm up in the air with this article to take to the production department, and they yell out, copy.
Right.
And the copy boy would get that, and he'd run it to the back shop. Well, it was kind of the same thing. The job that I would do is I would run copy. I would run articles that had been edited back to the production department where they could be typeset. And I would also have to maintain the ticker tape for the Associated Press wire that would be in this separate room, this insulated room, and it was just filled with just piles and piles of ticker tape that would pile up. And then I'd have to do work making newspaper clippings that the librarian would then file so they have an archive. But at the same time I was doing that, I would gravitate back and hang out with the photographers back in the photography department. And they were guys in their 20s, early 30s, and they were, we got along well, and they encouraged me, and I was able to do some work on the weekends, pick up some assignments on the weekends. So I was starting to do newspaper work when I was 16.
Well, that's cool.
As a copy clerk and also as a photographer. And the cool thing about these guys is that they would slip me rolls of film and boxes of photo paper and chemicals and stuff. So, and then I set up a darkroom at home.
Oh, that's cool. So,
and that's right about the same time I got a driver's license. So, it's like, hey, okay, here we go.
All right. Before we get much further, I have a story about dads and Christmas and making film, 8mm film in the 60s. What I remember of that is these unbelievably hot floodlights.
I can add something to that.
And my dad would be parading around the house, and he'd turn on these floodlights. And at first it was always like, hey, great, we're going to be on. And, as the Christmas day went on, you'd be like, you're sweating buckets.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I remember one year my dad put them down somewhere, and he burnt a hole in something he'd bought my mother for Christmas.
Oops.
Yeah.
See, my dad made such a production of this that us kids and my mom got him like a beret, and there's like this director's chair, and they wrote on the back, because his first name was Lou. They wrote on the sign and stuck it on this director's chair, Cecil B. DeLue. Like Cecil B. DeMille, right? So, and it's funny you mentioned these lights, because they were these super bright halogen or quartz lights, right?
Yeah.
And they burned like 10,000 degrees. So this is the model railroad story. My dad, before I must have been 12 years old or so, and I really coveted in this hobby shop this AHM Union Pacific Streamliner set. Boy, I wanted that. So I didn't know if I'd get it for Christmas or not, but I think my dad spending several weekends with a 4x8 sheet and building a Lupa track and painting it and, laboriously making it perfect, glossy green painted grass and everything on there, kind of was a clue to me that I'd be getting this train for Christmas. So got the train for Christmas, set it up. You remember the AHM? No, was it the AHM? Yeah. AHM?
Yeah, probably.
The passenger station that also doubled the same kit that would be Howard Johnson's.
Right.
You probably remember that one, right? So had that set up with the the train sheds and everything. And my dad set the camera up because he wanted some movies of this. And here was this light like a foot away from this passenger station. So you know what happened after a few minutes of filming. Here's the damn train sheds are collapsing down on themselves because the heat of this thing has melted the plastic. So
Well, my first article that ever was published, I'd had a couple of photos published in Model Railroad, but my first article ever published, I was taking pictures, and by then I was working with halogen lights, the 32K halogen lights, and I had them up so close, and I had a little photography studio when I was in my early 20s, but I didn't consider myself to be any kind of an expert. But I knew, and I had these lights set up, and I got the slides back, and I looked at it in this RS1. I'm thinking, I don't have the body sitting properly on the chassis. The body just wasn't sitting properly on the chassis. Well, of course, when I went to check it out, I had managed to melt the body and warp the whole thing. So yeah, that still applies. And now, of course, all that's gone with digital photography. Oh my goodness!
Sure.
Oh my
Who
goodness!
needs lights?
Yeah, exactly. Who needs lights anymore? I got all these lights and equipment and stuff I need to do something with. I don't think they're gonna. Go ahead.
Well, you're not going to melt anything with lights anymore. Now, you buy these little boxes of LEDs.
Yeah, I know.
Boom, fabulous stuff.
Just takes the fun out of everything.
Oh yeah, if you can't melt your project, what is it?
I got a bunch of Manfrotto stands and lights, and oh well. I did have the wherewithal to sell all my film equipment though early on, and managed to get something for it. So.
Yep.
So okay. So now, when do we feel like we're starting to become a dedicated train photographer, rail fan photographer?
Well, so we're digging through all these Trains magazines, and my dad had these heyday of the David P. Morgan issues there.
Right.
So he had all the great Phil Hastings pictures. He had the Shaughnessy pictures back east, all the Robert Hale, the Steinheimer stuff from the 60s. So I'm just absorbing all this stuff. This is just great, So I had to go out and try to replicate this. And, as I was talking with my youngest son last night, who thinks that he might want to get into painting, there's no shame in ripping people off to learn, because that's how you pretty much do it. So you go out there and you emulate, and, you take the squish lenses, the long lenses, and all this kind of stuff. And eventually you get more competent with what you're doing. But I was weaned on these Trains magazines, so I figured, well, this is really what I want to do. I want to start contributing to these magazines. So I would guess by 75, 76, 15, 16 years old, I was sending stuff off to Pacific News, which became Pacific Rail News, which became CTC Board or something like that, and Trains. And I think the first thing I got published in Trains was a book review maybe in 76, and a couple photos in the photo section and news sections, and then just took off from there. I tried to pitch some frontispieces, those little 2-page spreads that Morgan used to run at the beginning of the editorial section. Right. I sold a few of those. I don't think any of them were published, but he bought them because I think Morgan was real encouraging to new contributors. And so there we went. I moved up to Seattle, started writing some articles, did a piece on the Milwaukee Road that I wrote, I think it was published in 77, maybe 78, and I was 17. So
was that the Milwaukee Road across the Saddle and Cascade Ranges?
No, this is the one before. This was the thing about the helper engines that ran out of Tacoma, Mr. Clean's machines. And then that was followed up. I think there was an article then followed up with the article that you mentioned about the big article about going across the Cascades and the Saddles.
Right.
Which people always bring that up, and when I run into people, I go to train shows or whatever, or I'm at some photo exposition, someone will bring it up and I'll sign it. So that's kind of cool, because these people, were born like 20 years after this came out.
Yeah.
So so people remember that.
And you had like 15 or so articles in Trains magazine over the years, didn't you?
Yeah, quite a few, and then that's followed up with a few in Railfan, and did a fair amount in CTC Board. I got, when Dale Sanders took over that magazine in 78, I was their Northwest editor. For what that's worth, people send me their train sightings, and I try to make an idea and come up with whatever news was. It was like a monthly thing or every other month. So I was pretty engaged in all this. I think the last thing I had a thing in in the Chicago issue that Trains just put out
Right.
about a year ago about the CTA's elevated railways. That was the last article really that I wrote.
So you're one of these guys. I've been ever since we started talking. Actually, to be completely honest with you, I recognized your name as soon as we hooked up on Facebook. So, of course, I've been kind of following you, and I started thinking, I have got to get this guy on the podcast. And I mean, I've known of your name, well, probably since the 70s when you first started getting published in Trains magazine. And I mean,
Sure.
You're one of these guys. Some people, like I take okay pictures. The feather in my cap is I had 5 model railroader covers, which to me was a big deal. But my pictures were,
Sure.
I always considered my stuff to be like average or maybe just slightly above average. But you're one of those guys that just has an eye for it. I have a friend, Tim Warris, who owns Fast Tracks.
Yeah.
And he's just an unbelievable photographer. And I've only ever met 3 people: you, Tim Warris, and my friend / secretary Barb, her daughter, who's just gone off to school to be for graphic arts and that sort of thing. She has just an incredible eye for using a camera. And it's like, is it just something you're born with? It's like you got a good slap shot from the point, or?
It must be, because in the past few years I've gone back through all my negatives and I've started scanning a lot for this project that I'm working on. And I've noticed that there was I looked through this stuff that I first started shooting, and there's a lot of crap. And of course, there's crap on a couple levels. There's the crap that you don't have an eye for what you're doing.
Right.
So there's the compositional crap. And then there's the crap where you just don't learn. If you're doing your own darkroom work, it just doesn't work for you. You're lazy about mixing chemistry, so you have chemistry problems, or you have problems where you're just not good about you're not agitating film when you should, so you end up with problems with that. And then there's overdevelopment or underdevelopment and all that kind of stuff. So anymore with digital, all that's been pretty much taken away. So now it's just what you have to really think about is your composition. And I think that there came a point looking through all this stuff that into 78, 77, 78, then I really started looking at looking back through my negatives, that I started to develop an eye, started to develop a point of view that when I was making these photographs, what I wanted to say, and storytelling. And I think a lot of that, with as far as it went with the railroad, was absorbing it, what other photographers had done in Trains magazine. The other part was I happened to move to Seattle at a time and get interested in journalism at a time where there was an explosion of a new style of photojournalism. And that was being, a lot of it was centered in the Seattle area. So, there are a lot of great newspaper photographers in the Seattle area. It's led by Jerry Gay at the Seattle Times. He won a Pulitzer. There are all these guys up in Everett, Washington at the Everett Herald. It was a really competitive place to be a newspaper photographer. I mean, they would get people from all the top colleges, coming up from smaller newspapers wanting to get into Seattle because it was a real hotbed of photojournalism and this new development, not only in the way that the photographs were made, but in the way that they were presented, the display, the layout, and how photo essays were presented. So I was absorbing all this at the same time.
So right place, right time, and
right place, right time. Yeah.
So then you started so what's the project you're working on, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, it's coming up on the 40th anniversary of the end of the Milwaukee Road operations west of Miles City, Montana. And I've always had a lot of black and white photos. You recalled the article in Trains that you mentioned in 1979. So that brought me a lot of attention, and there was a lot of acclaim and everything to that article and such. But I continued shooting really heavily on the Milwaukee to the day that it stopped. I didn't do a lot afterwards, like the cleanup or any of the other stuff. But, it pretty much ended with me when the railroad ended. But, so I have, there were 600, 700 rolls of film or something shot between 1976 when I moved to Seattle and 1980 when the railroad shut down. So I've gone through and I scanned this stuff. There's probably 1,500 usable images out of this.
Wow.
And, I'm working on a book just black and white photography, just on the railroad west of the town of Othello, Washington. And good percentage of this is just going to be human interest photos of the railroaders.
Wow. That's going to be cool.
Okay. Here's a question for you. You mentioned black and white. And of course, that was one of the, about the only format available for a while until the colors came along. Do you compose things differently when you're working or worked in black and white than you would in color?
Well, it's kind of strange because growing up or doing a lot of my photography in Seattle, it was always, overcast and gray. So I ended up looking back in all the slides that I'd shot, and I'd shot a fair number of slides over the years, that a lot of the slides that I shot in Seattle were on overcast days, and that really didn't bother me. They're kind of dead and lifeless photos then, but I can scan them now, and they look a lot better. But I would, in those days, in the black and white versus color days, the film, the slides versus negative days, let's put it, I'd use color for different things. I would shoot color more for scenics, landscapes, that kind of stuff where the railroad isn't a bigger scene, right? Whereas the black and white I used a lot on the cloudier days, on the storytelling photos, the photos that were more photojournalistic in nature. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I noticed that there's a difference in digital, in the way people approach digital. I've had friends who shot nothing but slides. They never shot black and white, and they certainly weren't shooting photojournalism. People take pictures. So when they switched over from shooting Kodachrome or Fujichrome and they went over to shooting digital, it was kind of a weird change for them. And I still see this with a lot of photographers, that they think of the digital image that they get as being the end all. That is the final image that they get. Whereas guys who shot a lot of black and white, like myself, think of the digital image as more an analogy to being a negative. That it's just something, a point from which you start processing it. There's some people who, they take their digital picture and that's it. They don't mess around with it. And then there's the guys who had black and white or darkroom training who will see it as just a jumping off point to realize what your vision, what you wanted to photograph in the first place.
Yeah, so they're processing for color balance and
right,
contrast and whatever else they can do in Lightshop or whatever program they're using.
Yeah, I use Lightroom for most of my stuff, and I use like a cheap, stripped down version of Photoshop for what little else I can't do in Lightroom.
Right.
But so I always think that when I'm shooting, even shooting color or even digital today, I'm primarily thinking from a black and white standpoint.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So, were you like me? I mean, like I say, I considered myself at best to be an average photographer, nothing more, nothing less. Didn't ever really consider myself to be a photojournalist. But, like, for me, I always tell the story. I went down to my local in Toronto. There's a big, commercial photography house where you can buy all your equipment and stuff. And I finally decided I was going to take the plunge and buy I always worked with Canon, so I bought an SLR and, a digital SLR, and I brought it home. And I figured the process of learning how to do this was going to take me a couple of months. And, I loaded the program into my laptop. I went into my layout room. I took a couple of digital photos, came back, put them on my computer. This all happened the same day that I bought the camera that evening. And by the next day, I had my film equipment listed on eBay because it was like, oh my goodness, because I would write this column and I'd need 4 or 5 photos. And I mean, you'd only ever get 3 or 4 photos out of a roll of 36 by the time you bracketed everything. And I mean, when I went to digital, it was like, oh my goodness gracious sakes alive. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. Everything became so much easier. Now, you being a full-fledged photographer, did it seem that way to you, or?
Well, it was a 2-stage process here because I was still shooting slides and everything. Excuse me. I was still shooting slides and everything, and then got married and we were having a kid. So okay, well, let's get a digital camera. This newfangled digital thing that's coming out, right? So
right.
Bought this used Nikon. It was this kind of it's like a little box and it pivots doesn't look like an SLR or anything, but I did a little research. I said, oh, that's got good reviews. It's Nikon. Okay, I always shot Nikon gear. Got it. And 2 megapixels, big files. So
Right.
Takes great pictures, takes great model railroad pictures. You can put that camera right down at track level, and it's got amazing depth of field because it's it's such a short focal length lens comparatively because the sensor is small. So, but I did that article for Andy Sporandio for Model Railroad Planning, or was it? Yeah, that was for Andy on my layout, and I shot it all on Kodachrome or on Fujichrome slides. Set up the lights in the room, all this kind of stuff.
Right.
Shot rolls and rolls of that. And at the same time, just for giggles, I just shot the same stuff with the Nikon, with the little Nikon digital camera. Well, it was so much easier to make the Nikon digital the shots with the Nikons, right?
Right.
But all the stuff that got used in the magazine was, of course, the transparencies. Well, Canon came out in 2003, I think it was, with the first real consumer SLR.
Right.
And clearly this is where the future is headed. So I had all this Nikon equipment and everything, and I just said, you know what? Put it all on eBay. Get rid of it now. And eBay just started too, so that was kind of luck.
Right.
Get rid of it now before so much of it's on the market and the price drops. So I sold it all off. So I was without a camera for a couple of weeks, but then I went out, bought the Canon camera with a couple cheap lenses, and yeah, it was phenomenal. It was, it was great. Pictures were easy, and this is the future. No turning back from that.
Yeah, that sounds pretty much like my story. Now I feel like I'm a real photographer. Holy moly. I did the same as Blair. You know what?
Attaboy.
I feel like I'd be good at like handing you stuff. That's what I like. If we went together and you were doing some photography, I feel like I'd be good at handing you stuff. You'd be like, "Hey boy, get me that," or like get me a coffee. I feel like I'd be good at that.
That will go over to Tim Hortons.
Yeah, exactly. So
you get the 40 pack of Timbits and the large double.
Yeah, exactly. We're good. We're rocking and rolling. So, what was the actual last day of the Milwaukee Road?
The actual last day out of Tacoma was March 15th, 1980.
March.
So,
all right.
And it took them 5 or 6 more. And I just left it at that. That was the last train out, and I hadn't thought. Life's full of regrets, right? I don't know why I even regret about these things. But now there's so much information out there, copies of the dispatcher train sheets and everything, and train lists that have been scanned. And it's like, I could have had 4 more days of chasing those trains on the Milwaukee because it took them forever to get across Washington State.
Right.
So March 15th, 1980. That's the last day out of Tacoma.
And is the Milwaukee Road your favorite railroad, or is that just happened that it was in Seattle and that's what you photographed the most?
Well, went through a period of infatuation with it, and then after it died, there was, so many other things going on in life and other interests that came along railroad-wise. But I would guess because it was a railroad that I loved for a short period of time, and now it's gone and it'll never come back. It'll always have that place in your heart. Yeah, other railroads, some people, they steam engines are gone, but there's still a Union Pacific. There's the railroads that made up the Burlington Northern and now the BNSF. Well, at least those tracks are still in place. But the Milwaukee, it's just pretty much obliterated. Nothing left.
And how did the Milwaukee Road, not being a Milwaukee Road connoisseur, how did the Milwaukee Road end up all the way on the Pacific Coast?
Well, the story is that, it started out in the 1850s, 1860s. It's just a regional railroad in the Wisconsins and Illinois and up into Minnesota. And at the time, there was a lot of Granger, a lot of farm traffic and such. But then in the 1880s, the hill roads, the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern built to the West Coast. And the hill lines at that time also took control. I might be a little bit off on the history here, but generally took control of the Burlington route, and that became the primary interchange because the hill roads did not reach Chicago. So all this traffic came to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and then the primary channel for them to get into Chicago was over the Burlington. Now this shut off a lot of other railroads at Minneapolis and St. Paul. And the management of the Milwaukee Road figured, well, the only way we're going to really survive and grow the traffic is to build to the West Coast so we can develop our own traffic source to long haul, which was, an ill-advised proposition. Cost them far, far more than they ever expected to build. At the same time that just after they opened up the railroad, the Panama Canal opened up and took away a lot of that traffic that they otherwise would have had. It was an ill-advised venture from the get-go. It put the railroad into bankruptcy 3 times, and the traffic just never developed. There was never enough traffic along the northern tier to justify 3 transcontinental railroads. You also had the Union Pacific, which was coming from the northwest through Nebraska to Council Bluffs and interchanging on. A lot of the traffic came on the Milwaukee to Chicago. So there you go. You had 4 transcontinental railroads essentially into the north.
Now, the Milwaukee Road, when they started, they, of course, had the electrical part through some of the mountains. Was that
Right.
Originally envisioned to be a cost savings measure for them?
It did pay for itself, but the railroad was so highly engineered. I mean, and this is something that really grates at a lot of people who are just so myopic about the Milwaukee Road is that, and there are numerous sources online, very learned people who know how railroads operate and know what the cost is of everything. And these people who are just apologists for the Milwaukee will always say, well, it was the best engineered railroad. It had the shortest route, and it had electrification. Well, it had the electrification, but it also had 5 mountain ranges. And if you look at the operating costs of the Milwaukee versus the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific, the Milwaukee was far more expensive to operate than any one of these other railroads. It didn't have the traffic to justify because, if you're going to run a lot of trains, if you're going to run over a mountain, and you're going to put a lot of helper engines on trains going over mountains, it's better to have a lot of traffic. But even in its heyday, even if it's busiest time on the Milwaukee Road for transcontinental traffic, it never ran more than about 4 or 5 trains a day each way.
Huh.
So, okay, so you become a photojournalist.
Yep. Went to Western Washington University and got out of college and graduated in '84.
Hang on a minute. I'm rudely interrupting you.
Okay.
I'm got to have a meeting with the Bruces here. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to have a meeting with the Bruces. Bruces?
Yes.
Yes.
Gather in here. Gather close.
Huddle up.
Yeah, huddle up. Yeah, huddle up, Bruces. Oh, that's gonna get some mileage out of that. We're like 45, almost 50 minutes into this thing.
Yes.
And we're not even out of the teenage years. Like this guy is unbelievably interesting. At some point, we're gonna have to ask him if he can be a 2-parter. Because
I was thinking that.
Yeah, I'm thinking at the hour 15-minute mark, we're gonna close this one down and start again because there is so much to talk about with this fella. Is he looking?
Yeah.
Is he looking at us?
He's kind of wondering over his shoulder there, but okay, we can handle him.
Okay, on the count of 3, break. 1, 2,
Break.
3, break. So, anyways, Blair.
Huh?
There you go.
So you became a photojournalist.
Yes.
And and all the time you're getting articles published in Trains magazine.
Yeah.
You're just a young buck. You're driving north to Canada to buy beer.
That's right.
You're a huge Toronto Maple Leafs fan.
No. I was always a Flames fan.
Flames? Well, that's I guess.
I like Lanny McDonald.
Okay.
We'll go with that.
All right.
Just for the mustache alone,
The best mustache in hockey.
Yeah,
right there,
hell
yes,
yeah.
sir.
I came from the Toronto Maple Leafs.
True enough.
Oh, okay. Well, there you are.
Yeah, that's where he was drafted. He was drafted by the Toronto Maple Leafs and won his Stanley Cup with the Calgary Flames. Because in Toronto, we have a tradition of not winning championships anymore.
Yes.
And do you know where the Calgary Flames originally came from?
Atlanta.
Very good. Very good. Maurice Richard, was it Maurice Richard or his brother was involved with them somehow? Or Bernie Jeffrion was involved with them. That's who it was.
Boom Boom.
Boom Boom Jeffrion. You remember Boom Boom, don't you, Bruce? Kelly?
No, I don't.
He might have played for the Thunderhawks at one time.
Yeah, there you go. And I don't think I formally introduced you to the Bruces. But
No, you did.
But I'm
Too late now.
Too late. Too late now.
Bruce Wilson is the mail boy, and he's been with us since the beginning. And Bruce Kelly, who lives in Medford, Oregon. Bruce Wilson lives in Barrie, Ontario. And
Right.
Bruce Kelly, who lives in Medford, Oregon, Smoky Medford, Oregon, is the original. We have super fans, and he is the original super fan and the creator of the Kelly Questions, a staple on the old AML Network. Yeah, so that's the Bruces for you. Like I said, we have it's two Bruces, no waiting.
Yep.
So now you become a photojournalist. While you're taking all these, and where did you become a photojournalist? Like, what was the major newspaper you worked for?
Well, here's the progression would go. You'd try to find a summer internship, right? So the good ones would pay you.
Right.
The bad ones wouldn't pay you. So I only wanted to go to some place where I could make some money. So first summer internship, summer of '82, between my junior and senior year, was in Tacoma at the News Tribune, the Tacoma News Tribune.
Right.
And that thing paid union scale. So I was able to set myself up in a nice apartment, save some money, do some rail fanning, hang out at the beaches, buy some actual Nikon camera gear, some good Nikon camera gear. So that was '82. That was between junior and senior year. Then when I got out of college, I had to get a job. But I had one more summer internship, and I was in Boise, Idaho. So there you go, Boise, Idaho.
Yeah.
Worked at the Idaho Statesman. And see, this was a fortuitous spot here in the railfan world, because at the time, the Union Pacific had just brought half of their big Centennial locomotives out of storage. Remember those things?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And they were running them over the Blue Mountains and across the desert in Idaho and Oregon. So there I go. I was there. So I was set up. I know what I was doing on my weekends. So that thing petered out. Then I had to try to find a job, and had a lot of interviews, but getting the first job is always the toughest. I was lucky enough. I worked in Spokane, Washington for several months, and then I got my first job in Greeley, Colorado.
Okay.
So a little cow town, out on the prairie there, northeast of Denver. So I was there for 3 months. Kind of a crappy paper, but my boss was wonderful. And I was shooting some good stuff, some nice photographs, and I got called to apply for a job after 3 months there in Greeley in Ogden, Utah.
Wow.
And Ogden was a pretty good paper at the time. They had a pretty cool director of photography, and they had a good staff of other photographers you could learn from. So gladly went over there, and I went over to the Ogden Standard Examiner in, I guess, the fall of '84. No, 85, and stayed there until '91. Was married at the time, moved back to Spokane when my then wife got a job. She was also at the newspaper there. Got a job in Spokane, so I went back to Spokane and worked as a photographer, as their chief photographer out of one of their bureaus nearby in Idaho. So I was there till '93 or so, and then left the newspaper profession.
And left the newspaper profession because you were having so much fun, or?
Yes, it was such a delight. I wanted to try to do some other things within the newspaper industry, and I was getting kind of frustrated moving to another position somewhere. I wanted to get more into the digital design end of things, because the design revolution was kind of taking off in newspapers, and I wanted to get more involved with that, the computer design. But it was tough to make that transition. And I was getting kind of fed up doing the same thing, working in this bureau where I would be shooting basketball games 3 or 4 nights a week. And it was a pretty far-flung area I covered in North Idaho. I was based out of Coeur d'Alene, which is now this resort town. But at the time, in '85, it was just well, actually at the time, 89, 90, it was developing as a resort town. It used to be a logging town, and it became a resort town. But I would cover all the way up to the Canadian border.
Wow.
So I'd go up to Sandpoint, Idaho. I would drive about 40,000 miles a year for work. I'd go up and photograph, a basketball game one night in Coeur d'Alene. The next night I'd have to go up and drive up to Sandpoint, photograph a game. I made arrangements at the high school to use their high school photography lab. I would photograph for like 10 minutes of the game, process the film, print it while it was wet, while the film was still wet,
Right.
Make a print, put it on kind of a telecopier kind of thing that would pixelate the photograph and send it over a phone line. This is before digital photography and all this kind of stuff.
Right. Wow.
So I have to do that on deadline. And, so I was just kind of getting burned out on that. Wanted to move into the other aspect of the newspaper industry. Didn't have any opportunity with that. And then a friend who worked for Burlington Northern Railroad he worked in the roundhouse, I guess. And he was able to get on as a train dispatcher. And I was thinking, wow, that sounds like the job for me.
Right.
Because when I was photographing the Milwaukee Road, I would hang out a lot at various places on the railroad. And one of my favorite places to hang out with was the dispatching office in Tacoma. So this brings us up to about 1994. At the time, the railroad, the Burlington Northern, was still the Burlington Northern, and they were going to consolidate all their dispatching offices. They had like 8 dispatching offices throughout their system. They were going to just consolidate them all in Texas for tax reasons, of course.
Right.
And in order to do this, they'd have to move all their dispatchers down there. Well, a lot of dispatchers didn't want to move. They liked living in Seattle. They didn't necessarily want to move to Fort Worth, Texas.
Right.
So the railroad anticipated they'd lose about 30% of their dispatchers, and which normally in the past wouldn't have been a problem because they would just draw from the ranks of train order operators. But as we all know, train order operators were a thing of the past by the 90s, replaced by track warrants and giving authorities directly to trains.
Right.
So they shut down all the depots, so they didn't have all these telegraphers and train order operators that they could promote to train dispatchers. So they had to resort to hiring people off the street and training them to be train dispatchers. So I was able to get hired on in that program and went to dispatching class for the summer of '94 in Kansas City, and then got out of the dispatching class, got hired by the Burlington Northern, and got assigned to the Seattle office in the fall of 1994, with the full knowledge that sometime in '95 I would join everybody else on the railroad down in Fort Worth. And that's what happened there.
And you've been there ever since.
Been here in Texas ever since. Yep.
Working as a railroad dispatcher.
Working as a railroad dispatcher. Yep.
So are you like the penultimate rail fan then?
No. No.
It sounds like it to me. You've had a storied career in railroad photography. You've been involved in Trains magazine. You've been in great model railroads, and now since 1994. So we're coming up to almost 25 years. You've been working as a railroad dispatcher.
Yeah, you'd think I'd be wearing one of those vests with all the patches on it, as much as I've been involved in railroads. But that's not the case. It's my railroad interests have been fairly narrow in what I've been interested in, what I've been involved in. I've not been a big joiner in the community, and anymore, I don't do much railroad photography except very specific things that really interest me. It's like I don't follow a lot what's going on in the modern railroading. I don't, I couldn't identify any of these new locomotives. I don't read many of the magazines. So the railroad is a job and it's a paycheck, and I get enough, I do my 40 hours a week on the railroad, and that's enough for me. And
do you enjoy it?
I enjoy aspects of it, and I don't want to get too deep in it because I am an employee of a company that's been known to be punitive towards employees who say too much.
Right. Yeah.
So I will say that I'm happy to be there, and I'm looking forward to my last 7 years so I can retire.
Okay.
So,
And so you officially work for
the
BNSF.
The railroad with the 4 letters that don't mean anything. That's right. People say, "Oh, Burlington Northern Santa Fe," and I say, "No, that's not the name of the railroad. The railroad's name is BNSF."
Okay. I wonder why they decided that. Who knows? Who knows?
They could have come up with better
easier to
initials.
spell.
What can I say?
Yeah.
That's right.
We just spent a weekend at Rochelle, Illinois, at the train park there. We had a barbecue there, and of course BNSF is one of the railroads that crosses there.
Sure.
And so, what areas do you dispatch? Can I ask you that?
Yeah, I dispatch former Great Northern Territory between. There's all great hockey country up there.
Right.
Between Minot, between Dilworth / Fargo, and Grand Forks, and then west to Minot.
All right. Now, how many? What do you work an 8-hour shift? Obviously.
8-hour shift. Yep, 5 days a week.
And is it like do the shifts vary? Like, are you sometimes nights, sometimes days, some kind of that kind of thing, or?
No, there are extra board people who can work whatever shift they need them for. There are essentially 3 shifts on the railroad a day. There's a first trick, which would be from 6:30 a.m. to 2:30 in the afternoon.
Right.
There's a second trick, which would be afternoons, which would be from 2:30 p.m. to 10:30 at night, and then there's third trick. We call it midnight, or
right.
People would call it graveyard, between 10:30 and 6:30 in the morning. Each have their own advantages. Each tend to attract a different type of person. Now, there are also relief jobs, because a job my job would be 5 days a week, which leaves 2 days a week it has to be filled. So they have to cobble together a relief job, which would either work 2 afternoons and 2 days and 1 midnight, or on one job, or it could work a whole different number of jobs. There are some jobs there are some relief positions that work 3 different shifts during the week, with split days off, and with 3 or 4 different territories that you're working.
Wow.
Those are usually low seniority.
Yeah.
So.
And at 20, what'd you say? 20, how many years you got in now? 23?
Let's see. September 30th will be 23.
Are you ciphering right now? You're doing some ciphering?
Ciphering? Yeah.
Ciphering by the cement pond?
Fingers and toes, right? That's right. Make some lye soap.
And are you on a regular shift now?
Yes. I was fortunate not to have to undergo a long period of time working the extra board without any certainty of what my shifts are, because I was hired at a time when they just hired a bunch of dispatchers, but I'm fairly early in that bubble of new hires from the mid 90s. So when they closed down the Seattle office and we moved everybody to Fort Worth, there were a few people who at the last minute decided they weren't going to move. And their positions in Fort Worth were available. So I came down here, and they had, what they would do is you would bid in a 6-month temporary. The job would be yours for 6 months. Until then, they'd put it up for bid. And as it happened, I came down here and was able to get a job with Monday through Friday with weekends off, which is pretty unheard of with no seniority. And I had that for 6 months. And then after that 6 months passed by, I was able to never have to work the extra board again. So,
wow.
So, and it's been a weird transition, because when I hired out, I was 35, and there weren't a lot of young people working as train dispatchers back then, because it was pretty much a promotional thing that most of the people who were train dispatchers at the time had come up as train order operators and had done that for quite a while. And then they became train dispatchers, and there was a real craft to it. There was a real fraternity and a real craft to being a train dispatcher, because it still is. I'm not going to downplay that. The tremendous amount of responsibility in moving these trains safely. But you also had this whole hierarchy where train order operators were looked down upon by train dispatchers. They weren't train dispatchers. You didn't talk back to train dispatchers. So, you had that whole kind of catechism that was taught to you coming up the ranks. Well, now the railroad is just going to hire people off the street, And, where are they going to get these people? Well, I don't know why I got hired. I expressed an interest in the railroad during the interview process without trying to be too much of a rail fan.
Right.
Although I'm sure they figured that out. But as time went by and the railroad mainly hired people in Texas, now you're going to hire a certain number of new dispatchers who used to be in train service or who were signal maintainers or worked in the track department, but only to a point. And then after that, you had to start finding people off the street who wanted to be train dispatchers. So, over time, there's been various, we hired for quite a while a lot of ex-military people. There were a fair number of ex-military people who were military air traffic controllers who didn't get hired by our FAA as air traffic controllers, so they came down here as railroad dispatchers. But there's been a whole wide variety of other people that they've hired. I've worked with people who were hired who used to be zookeepers, hairdressers, people that managed Quiznos stores, you name it. I mean, there's just a wide variety of people who've joined the craft, but it's not as much of a craft as it used to be because the job has changed a lot over the 25 years I've been there.
So how many trains would you deal with in a night, in a shift? What is your shift? Like what hours do you work?
I work 2:30 in the afternoon to 10:30 at night.
And do you enjoy that?
Well, the reason I'm on that job, now I have worked all 3 shifts on this job. I have been the owner of a first trick job on this. First, I was the owner of the third trick job on this position. And then I got displaced by someone because the railroad is always trying to save money by consolidating desks, lumping pieces of one territory onto another territory to save money. And they will have job displacement. So someone's job will be displaced and they will use their seniority because we're all union dispatchers. They will use their seniority and displace a junior person. And that person will then get displaced and find another desk that they want to work at. So it's this big domino effect. So, I used to work midnights, and then I got bumped off that, and then I ended up because the midnight shift was actually preferable to the day shift. Right. Because the days off were slightly better on midnights. The king of the midnight shifts would be having Friday and Saturday off. That way you get, Friday night, Saturday night off. You don't have to come into work till Sunday night. So, you get the good weekend nights off.
Right.
So, got bumped off thirds, went on to days, worked on that for a while, and then some more job consolidations happened, and I got bumped off that. And me being old and lazy, I say, I really don't want to learn another job. And I really don't care if I have weekends off or not, because living in the DFW area, it's murder to get around anywhere on the weekends.
Oh, so really?
It's misery. It's hell on earth. So I bumped onto the afternoon job, and, with all this seniority that I have, to work a job with Monday and Tuesdays off is pretty stupid on my part. But I'm a path of least resistance guy these days anymore. The reason I'm on the job is it isn't a tremendously burdensome job. It's mostly all CTC, which means I just have to line up signals. I don't have to issue authorities over the radio, track warrant authorities. So it suits me fine. It isn't a complex job. It isn't a high priority job in that there aren't a lot of high priority trains on it. So, it's a good job for me.
It's a job. Yeah, it's a job.
One of the things I've heard about the centralization process for the dispatching is that it tends to remove the dispatchers a fair distance from the territories they're looking after, and therefore they may not be totally familiar with them. Do you get a chance to get out at all to visit your territory so you know what it's like as far as the grades and crossings and what the train crews may be up against, that type of thing?
Yeah, Bruce, that's a really good point. And it used to be like when I was in the Seattle office. I dispatched territory that I was, furthest away I could be was maybe a 6-hour drive, but most of it was right in the area. In fact, I could go out the the back door of the office and watch trains go by, which was, to me, this is what dispatching offices should be. When we moved all down into Fort Worth, we're in this big concrete bunker, and we're not near any tracks. And, and I've dispatched territory ranging from most of the jobs in the Pacific Northwest all the way across the northern tier lines on the railroad. I've dispatched Colorado. I've dispatched Nebraska. And most of it I have not seen. Now, certain management regimes will come and go, and they want to put money out in the budget for dispatchers to go on road trips. And I've certainly done a lot of those. And most of the territory that I worked the job over the Marias Pass in Montana, in mountain grade in the winter, and I'm kind of take a little internal pride in having dispatched that and having to dispatch helpers and all that, but I never went on a road trip. They weren't offering them at the time. The times that I've dispatched in Nebraska and North Dakota and flat areas, that seems to be the time they seem to offer up road trips, but I don't always take them up on road trips because there's a lot of the physical things that I need to learn about the railroad, I can learn off of track profiles.
Right.
And charts and know where the crossings are and all that kind of stuff. And then, you develop physical characteristics, learning how long, where the grades are and, what crews can run faster than others, although that's less of a factor now than before. And the territory I'm on now, running times really are not a big tool you need to know to dispatch it. Because, when I came up, you'd sit with this old head dispatcher who'd been there 30 years, and oh my God, I'm almost there now. But anyway, and he'd drill it into your head before he'd even let you sit in the chair and break in on the job. What's the running time? When's this train going to be here after it meets this train at point B? Where's it's going to go to C to meet the train and then go over to A? What time are they going to be there? And you had to figure all that out and tell him. And, he'd slap you on the fingers and say, no, that's wrong. But, so they'll offer you these road trips, but I've been on enough road trips that there are two fundamental things you're going to get out of a road trip. One is you'll be stuck on this train with a crew, and God bless these train crews. I mean, they have to put up with a lot out there, and I'm just the bearer of bad news most of the time. I have to tell them what's going on, and it's decisions that a lot of times I have no control over. But one thing, you're going to be stuck on a train with a crew for probably 12 hours, and if you're stuck in there with the wrong crew, all you're going to get ear banged for 12 hours is, why don't you do this? Don't you realize that? You get that. So that's the number one thing. The other two thing is they say, hey, that third chick dispatcher's got a sexy voice. What does she look like?
So I wonder if anybody's ever said that about you.
I had another dispatcher. She's retired now. Helen was great. I love working with Helen, but she worked on the other side of the building. And she came over one day and she says, I just had to meet you because I've been listening to your voice on this radio skip. This radio would, bleed over onto her channel. She says, and you sure have a good radio voice.
Well, that's perfect because we're on a podcast and people can listen to you. Right now, you got to realize right this minute, right as we're speaking, right this minute, there's a guy driving between Anchorage, Alaska, and halfway to Fairbanks, listening to you in the dark of the night, pulling two 40-foot-plus trailers through the darkness of Alaska, probably in the wintertime. This will probably be aired in the wintertime. And he's desperately trying to keep these things on the road and watching out for moose at the same time.
And he's saying, thank God I'm not a train dispatcher.
And he's also saying, boy, does that guy have a voice for radio. And he's also way past where he's got to find Art Chase and talk about
that's right.
him.
He missed the turnoff with the boiler.
So I have
boiler he's hauling out.
We're going to come to the end of this part one of the 32-part Blair Kooistra trilogy. But do some crews actually operate faster than others?
I don't think so much anymore. There are so many ways now that crews are monitored that there's really no incentive for them to operate fast. I hate to say it, but there's a lot of rules that have come out. there's a lot of rules that the federal government, that darn federal government, has, put on the railroads. There's a lot of new systems that monitor how the trains are driven, monitor the brake settings, monitor whether you use the horn. The railroad wants to put inward-facing cameras in the cab, so if there's ever an issue, they could pull the tapes and see if you're picking your nose when you should have been writing down what that last signal you passed was. So there's really no incentive to really get over the road for these crews.
Right. They've just sterilized the whole thing.
Pretty much. Everyone's no one wants to get caught doing anything that's breaking the rules, and they don't want to give anyone a reason to go looking around to see it if you broke a rule or not.
Yeah.
I think everyone wants to play it safe and be safe out there and, not take any risks.
And Blair, you're new to the podcast, so you wouldn't be aware of this, but do you know why I have this podcast?
No, I don't.
It's so I can listen to the sound of my own voice. So when you were talking about how what's the word I'm looking for, Bruce's? Sterilized. When you were talking about how sterilized they've made operating a train nowadays, it brings me to something that I posted several months ago on my Facebook page about when did the rules in the institution become more important than life itself, about the hospital I attend. And the hospital I attend is a wonderful place. It's an absolutely wonderful place full of wonderful people. But you can see that the rules in the institution have almost become so important because they have, like, it's exactly the way you described it, operating a locomotive. They have all these rules and everything, and they've almost sterilized it to a point where they've taken the human element out of it altogether, which is happening in so many facets of life all over the world.
Well, on the railroad, that's been the move for the past 50, 60 years, is to just eliminate as many people as possible. And, it will continue. I mean, we have this big mandate with the PTC, the positive train control, which is fine, and it's a laudable effort, and it's a thing that, would need to be done to keep trains from colliding into each other and have some kind of fail-safe mechanism, which is fine, and I'm going to get on my soapbox, and hopefully it won't offend anybody. But if it was just a system to keep trains from crashing into each other, that is a great thing. But it's become so much bigger than that, because we're in the world now where data drives everything. You know about that in the hospitals.
Right.
They're all looking at numbers, right? Everything's a number, and the same it is with the railroads. This PTC rollout has gotten extraordinarily expensive and extraordinarily complex because not only do the trains have to, talk to the GPS satellites and know where they are in relation to each other, but they're also constantly uploading this information that's going into mainframe computers, and it's being it's going to be extrapolated and incorporated into dispatching systems. And, eventually, if you look down the road and you see what the iron ore railroads are doing in Australia, they want to be able to take all this data with this artificial intelligence that can be rolled out of it and just get rid of people from running trains. Once there's enough data out there where we know that the train that's this heavy and has this braking characteristics and it has this horsepower per ton and the weather's like this, et cetera, the thing can run itself if you program the computer properly. And this is just all a way of just hauling a ton of information. Just mind-boggling amounts of information. They're just getting sucked into these computer systems to create databases on all this stuff.
And you can't, I don't think you can remove the human element the problem is once everything becomes institutionalized like this, they lose track of the human element. And once they lose track of that, then things start to go the wrong way as far as I'm concerned.
Well, the bottom line with the human element, Lionel, is this. Who do we blame when something goes wrong? Because if there's no one there to blame, you got to have someone in there.
Well, yeah, and I mean that's just life. Mistakes happen, things happen.
That's true.
You know, and once you remove life from life, well, then that's a whole different ball of wax. That was pretty heavy, don't you think, guys?
Yeah. Oh yeah,
that's heavy. That's heavy, man.
Yeah. Man.
That is like solid, right on. I always remember that was my other show from back then was the Mod Squad.
Oh yeah.
Right on, exactly. And then
Link.
It was Link,
Yep.
and he was
Link.
always holding his fist up, and he was going heavy. That's heavy, man.
Heavy.
That's heavy.
Heavy.
Right on. All right. You know what? We're at the end of part 1 of the 37-part Blair Kooistra. That's it? Kooistra? Is that correct? Kooistra?
That's it.
All right.
Yep.
Is it Blair? Is that how you say it?
Yep.
Do you mind if I call you Steve?
Call me Bruce.
Yeah, exactly. All right.
Then we become a Monty Python sketch.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know what? Our podcast pretty much already is a Monty Python sketch. So, we've come to the end of the first chapter of the 43-part trilogy, and if you don't mind, we'd like to continue on with a part 2, if you're available. And,
sure.
And also, we need Bruce. Bruce, I like this part. Bruce, super fan number 1, Bruce Kelly. Would you like to give out the email address?
Yes, if you want to contact us through the wonders of email, our email address is modeler'slife. That's modelers one L like Blair, not 2 L's like Kelly, at gmail.com.
Wow. Mr. Wilson, did you see how he jumped right on that?
He did. He kind of like hit that one to the deepest part of the field.
That one, yeah.
I've been practicing.
I love that. That was beautiful. Hey, you know what that was, don't you, Mr. Wilson?
That's another Lincoln Homer.
You'll pick all this up, Mr. Blair, when you're as time goes along. When you listen to the 6 days worth of podcasts that are out there. But I
better start driving to Fairbanks.
Yeah, exactly. And we have a Facebook page. It's facebook.com/modelerslife. And we have a website, amodelerslife.com. And so everybody that wants to see us out there. So, Blair, we have a job for you at the end of the show. We have an important job for you, and all you have to say is "Happy Rails" to you.
All right.
You want me to write?
Right.
You want me to write that down for you?
I haven't been memorized. I heard. I listened to Shane Murphy screw it up a few times. So.
Now that guy's a character, and you know Shane, don't you?
I know Shane. Hey, and I have a question for you.
I'm sorry, we don't take questions.
What does RSS stand for, anyway?
That is really
simple
syndication.
There we go.
And you know who taught us that?
That would be Chris Atkins.
Exactly.
Yes.
He's the guy. Shane Murphy's the guy that burned his layout, and Chris Atkins is the guy that bought the shell.
Yes, I was there at. I was in that freight house that Shane bought, or the railroad bunkhouse, when we were designing his layout on a huge sheet of gypsum board one day.
All right, well, that's a story for part 2.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Part 2 will be the model railroading aspect.
Yeah, we got to get into
All
that.
right.
I got a bunch of questions I wrote down too. None of them are about Blair, but there's quite a few about me. I'm kidding. All right, hang on. I got to find the script. All right. So at the appropriate moment, you have to say, "Happy Rails" to you.
Got it.
Okay. Do you feel like you're prepared?
I'm on stage, ready to go.
Okay. Well, Blair, as we close the barn doors on another episode of A Modeler's Life, and the sun slowly sets over the back 40, I guess there's nothing else left to do except for you to say,
Happy Rails to you.
It's another Lincoln Homer.